Need this tonight. Across the country, an earthquake in Canada has now triggered a tsunami warning for parts of Alaska. The earthquake was a magnitude 7.7. We are monitoring the situation and we'll bring you more as we learn it again. An earthquake up in Canada has triggered a tsunami here in parts of Alaska.
Let's check in now with John Cassidy, who is a seismologist with the federal government. He's on the phone with us right now. Hi, John.
Hi, is that Ian?
Yes, it is. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Ian.
And I'm here in the studio with Renee Filipponi. Tell us what you know about this earthquake.
Well, the largest earthquake in Canada in about 60 years, since 1949, so just over 60 years. This was a magnitude 7.7 earthquake just to the west of Haida Gwaii. It occurred at 8:04 p.m. Pacific time this evening, and we've been recording a large number of aftershocks, including several up into the magnitude 4.5 to 5 range. This earthquake, we've had no at this point. I've heard no reports of damage other than items falling from shelves, but felt over a very large area of coastal British Columbia and inland as far as Prince George and Kamloops and Houston. So felt over a very wide area.
Let's go through a few of the basics on this earthquake, if we may. First of all, this magnitude of 7.7, as you say, by any measure, this is a big earthquake. Should we be surprised that so far, and perhaps at the end of the day, no reports of significant damage?
Well, we still, of course, can't rule out damage from this earthquake. It could be that we haven't heard from those communities or those people who may have experienced any damage. So we can't rule that out at this point, but a 7.7 is certainly a very large earthquake and would cause damage in a populated region. This earthquake was, of course, offshore. It was just west of the islands, and so not directly beneath or very close to communities. So there was a bit of distance there that would minimize potential for damage.
And John, you and I have spoken many times before. We are live now on CBC Television in British Columbia, CBC News Network across the country, and also CBC Radio here in British Columbia. Remind me what your title is, and so we can let our audience know.
Absolutely. I'm an earthquake seismologist with Natural Resources Canada and based in Sydney, British Columbia.
So we talked about the magnitude. Let's go on now to the aftershocks. The magnitude of these, a couple of things strike me about these aftershocks. First of all, that some of them are pretty big, in the 5s, and secondly, that they were recorded pretty quickly after the initial earthquake. Is that normal for an earthquake of this type?
That is quite normal. The aftershocks for a magnitude, and the rule of thumb is that the largest aftershock on average that we might see would be 1 magnitude unit smaller than the main earthquake. And so for a 7.7, you may see aftershocks as large as 6.7.
Wow. That
would be looking at sort of a global average. So the aftershocks that we've been recording so far in the magnitude 4.5 to 5 range are large events in their own right, but still relatively small for aftershocks of an earthquake of 7.7.
We're talking to John Cassidy, a seismologist with the Government of Canada. And John, what can you tell us about the likelihood of a tsunami? We've heard there's an alert, but given what you know about the magnitude here, about the terrain in this area, what should we know about the likelihood of a tsunami?
Well, when you have a large earthquake like this beneath the ocean, there's always a potential for tsunami, and there was a tsunami warning issued from the northern tip of Vancouver Island up to Alaska, the Alaska Panhandle. And my understanding from at this point is that a 20-centimeter was observed at Langara Island a short time ago. So I haven't heard of any tsunami reports other than that measurement at Langara. The earthquakes that we typically record in the Haida Gwaii are what we call strike earthquakes, and these are the plates sliding past one another, and so they generally do not generate significant tsunamis because of that horizontal movement rather than a vertical movement on the seafloor. Now, of course, any strong earthquake can generate landslides or submarine slides that can initiate localized tsunamis. And so the best advice is if you feel strong shaking and you're close to the water, to move to higher ground.
So just before we let you go, John, I just want to go over that point again. You were saying, if I understood correctly, this is an earthquake with the two plates sliding next to each other, creating the kind of movement that, did I understand you correctly, likely doesn't cause a big tsunami?
That's correct. In previous large earthquakes in this region, that horizontal movement doesn't generate substantial tsunamis, but there's always the potential from these large earthquakes that if landslides are generated or submarine landslides, that localized waves can be generated. And so it's always, the best advice is always, if you're in this region, you feel strong shaking, to move to high ground if you're close to the water.
John Cassidy, seismologist with the federal government. As always, it's a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
And we'd like to welcome all of our listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. And we'd like to welcome all our listeners on CBC Radio 1. They are now picking up our coverage here so that they can also be informed about all the information we have. And again, that tsunami warning has now been expanded. It initially was just from Alaska to the northern tip of Vancouver Island, but they have now expanded that right to the Washington-Canadian border, which is probably the most significant change in this story, I'd say, in the last half hour or so. So definitely something people should be aware of out there.
All right, so if you've been watching us, if you've been listening on CBC Radio, stay tuned, because on a story like this, you never know when we're going to get an interesting development in terms of hearing from somebody in a different part of British Columbia who has firsthand experience of what's going on. And our plan is just to stay on the air until 11 o'clock Pacific time with that information as it comes in, or longer if need be. Dan Burritt joins us now live. And Dan, give us an update on what you've been looking at.
Well, Ian, as you've been mentioning, we've had a whole raft, and in fact, the phone in the newsroom has not stopped ringing just after 8 o'clock when we started, as Renee mentioned earlier, seeing those tweets come in fact, everywhere from up north down here. We've had people calling from Vancouver, New Westminster, Vanderhoof, Masset, a gentleman who called, as we've heard before, who said his pot on his stove started rattling and his cactus plant started shaking and he wasn't sure exactly what was going on. Again, that earthquake, as was mentioned, is below that, Masset being on the top end of Haida Gwaii. So again, you can tell that this is a very large earthquake, and John Cassidy referenced that 7.7 on the magnitude scale. That being said, in some areas we haven't heard any reports of damage, although when we did speak with Perry Schmunk, they're taking no chances. And as Renee has mentioned, they've extended that tsunami warning, in fact, all the way from BC's coast all the way down to Washington State. So they're not taking any chances at this point.
Now, Dan, when that tsunami warning, we're talking about this, you've heard a message from the Provincial Emergency Preparedness. They sent out a message about that. What are people supposed to know if they do live in one of these tsunami areas? What is the province telling them if they're sitting at home wondering, what am I supposed to do? Well,
there are two areas that they're talking about. Again, it was just two areas, but that's been extended down to Washington State. If they are in a low-lying area, if they're on a beach, anywhere where they would be lower than the regular high tide, they need to leave. That is the basic message that we're trying to get across. And as the provincial emergency program has been inundated with calls, this is standard procedure where they send out, in fact, a recorded message that can be played. Just in the past few minutes, we've been hearing that a Justice Minister, Shirley Bond, is going to be doing a conference call, so she'll be able to hopefully give us an update on other things that they're going to be doing, whether in terms of it's any rescue whatsoever, whether it's shelter for people who are out of their homes, whether they've had to move off of beaches. Keep in mind as well, a lot of marinas up and down BC's coast. Anybody who has a boat has been told to leave. If they're on a boat, get out. That's an area where you don't want to be if you're in a low-lying area. Hopefully we'll be able to hear from the Justice Minister in a short time, that being because the Justice Ministry oversees the provincial emergency program. Renee?
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. It is coming up to 10:26 here Pacific time. Again, we are broadcasting live on CBC News Network, CBC Television in British Columbia, and CBC Radio as well about this big earthquake that struck in Haida Gwaii. Let's go through some of the basic facts for you. The magnitude 7.7, and that as it struck, as I mentioned to you, Haida Gwaii, the quake reported just after 8 p.m. Pacific time. The epicenter just under 200 kilometers southwest of Prince Rupert. As you've heard, a tsunami warning is in effect from Alaska to Washington State, all the way up and down the Pacific coast of British Columbia. But at the same time, you heard John Cassidy, the seismologist for the federal government based on Vancouver Island, saying that this type of earthquake, where two plates slide against each other, that kind of movement is usually not associated with big tsunamis. So let's obviously hope that that is the case here.
Absolutely. And lots of really great information from him, just understanding, you don't want to create a sense of fear, a sense of panic, but at the same time it's important for us to understand what those warnings are and what people are supposed to be doing if they do live in any of the areas. The earthquake is over now. We're still trying to find out exactly, what kind of damage happened up there in northern BC around the Haida Gwaii. But that tsunami warning is still real. It's still in effect for people living on the coast right across the province at this hour.
And for those of you in the Vancouver area, you may remember, I think it was about a year ago, there was a bump. The magnitude really small, like it was something like 2.5 or 3. But I remember listening to the radio that day. I was out working on a story, and person after person called in over this huge area talking about what they had felt. And they ended up saying the same sorts of things, and it was interesting the picture they painted collectively. So I know a lot of you are calling our CBC newsroom. Dan is logging what people are saying, and please do continue to do that, because we'd like to talk to some of you on the air and others who are certainly paying attention to what you're saying.
Absolutely. And Alicia Grabinski joins us now. She is our host of our Daybreak morning show for CBC Radio in Prince Rupert. She felt the earthquake and has been chasing the story from up there in Prince Rupert. Alicia?
Hello, Renee. Yes, at about 8:15 tonight, like many people in British Columbia, we felt it here in Prince Rupert. I was at a house, and it almost felt like a massive wind was making the home shake. But of course, it wasn't long before we found out it was the 7.7 earthquake, and the light fixtures were shaking, and there were chimes in the window that started to clink, and it almost made my stomach turn. It was a very strange, unusual feeling. First time I've felt that. So, of course, we've been making calls tonight trying to find out what the impact could be here in Prince Rupert, and we do know that there is a disaster crew that has gathered at City Hall here in town. They're waiting for instructions and making a plan. We do know that a number of the ports that export coal and grain and other goods have been shut down, and all people working there have been told to leave. However, the Port Authority is saying that they expect the effect to be, quite low here in Prince Rupert. We did hear from Dave McKenzie, who is the fire chief, and he says that they are telling people who live on low-lying areas that they are warning them about the potential of a tsunami, and that they have a choice of whether or not they want to leave, but it is not an evacuation order. But for those who do decide to leave their homes, they're gathering at the Civic Center, which is a community center here in Prince Rupert.
And Alicia, just one last question. How would you describe the feeling up there of people you're speaking with, people you're talking to about what's going on right now?
Well, as soon as the quake hit, of course, everybody was texting and tweeting and trying to figure out what happened. It's unusual to feel something like that here, and so everybody's just scrambling for information, trying to find out what's going on. It's almost, you could almost call it a little bit of excitement, which maybe seems a bit strange, but people are just trying to figure out what happened and what the impact could be, and of course, everybody's talking about it.
Thanks, Alicia. That's Alicia Grabinski, the Daybreak North host based out of CBC's Prince Rupert Bureau. And just a reminder again that this was a 7.7 earthquake that struck just over 100 kilometers south of Masset on Haida Gwaii, and a tsunami warning still remains in effect for folks living on the coast anywhere from Alaska right to the Washington-U.S. border.
I think we have a guest. I think we have a guest on the phone now. Oh, okay. Oh, I thought we had a guest on the phone, but we don't. You're going to see those kinds of moments over the next half hour or so as we just keep rolling through our coverage here, and obviously we are making changes as we go. I was also thinking for people who are watching, particularly across the country on CBC News Network, who may be wondering what exactly Haida Gwaii is. Right. Those of us in British Columbia familiar with the name for what used to be called the Queen Charlotte Islands. So you saw a map just a short time ago, and there is the map there. So people of a certain age, Renee, across the country might remember it. And I noticed some of the American media comments
still calling it the Queen Charlotte.
Yeah, so just in case you're wondering where it is, you can see that in relation to Prince Rupert, British Columbia as well.
And that island, as many people know, not extremely populated. People are watching from across the country, and particularly where the epicenter of that quake was, quite south on the island, the two major cities on the island being Masset and Queen Charlotte. It wasn't right close to either of those cities, so where the epicenter was you know, there isn't a lot right there. But this part of the province is very remote. There are lots of small communities, lots of Aboriginal communities. You know, so when we're trying right now to assess just how widespread, if there is any damage, it will take a while to get that information in because there are so many small, very isolated communities in that part of the province.